Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian, and we have with us Tim Mack. And you know where in the world he is? He's where the action is. Tim, where are you?
I'm in London where there have been negotiations just in the last 24 hours over the latest movement on this Trump proposal for a peace plan. Happy to get into it with you. A lot of the discussions that were planned to have taken place this week over this peace plan were kind of downgraded. Marco Rubio, who was slated to come here, ended up not coming to London. Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's envoy to Russia, was planning to come here, didn't end up coming here, instead opting to go to make another visit, his fourth, I believe, to Russia. And so we're seeing very, very slow movement on a plan that, frankly, Ukraine and Europe are very reluctant to get behind.
When you say they've been downgraded, does that mean that, at least on the United States side, they realize that this is going nowhere, at least at this stage?
Well, you usually want the principals, that is the top people in any agency or ministry, only to show up when there's a deal to sign, or where you're close enough on the technical elements of a
Yeah.
deal, whether this is a business deal, government peace deal, any sort of negotiations. You want to get it 95% of the way before the Secretary of State shows up, because the Secretary of State's time is extremely, extremely valuable. So it's a kind of recognition they haven't made enough progress for the Secretary of State to show up or for key envoys to go. The delegation was led by General Keith Kellogg, who is the Trump envoy to Ukraine, but he's been sidelined on a lot of these issues recently, ostensibly and apparently because he's too pro-Ukrainian. And we should get into some of these elements of the peace deal, because it's very clear that this is a deal in which Trump and the Trump administration are trying to squeeze Ukraine into essentially capitulation.
Main elements. One, that essentially Russia would get to keep everything that it has gained, rewarding this war of aggression. And secondly, that Ukraine could never be part of NATO. Is everything that Putin has wanted, is there anything in there that Ukraine could look at that they would want?
It would get a little bit of territory in Kharkiv that Russia currently holds. It would get free access to the a river along the front line, a major river called the Dnipro, that runs through some of the areas that Russia now controls. There's very specific concessions to Russia and very vague promises to Ukraine. Um, Ukraine is going to get some vague security guarantees that don't involve American peacekeepers, to be worked out by other folks. It doesn't really say that Ukraine gets all that much. I think the Trump administration view is we're effecting an end to the violence, and that should be good enough for you under any conditions. And that's just not where the Ukrainians stand right now.
Or the Europeans for that matter. It seems impossible that Ukraine could ever agree to these terms. So if they don't, what happens then? Trump and Rubio have both said things like, well, we'll just move on. What does that actually mean?
They've left it purposely very confusing and ambiguous. I mean, there's no clear indication of what that means. Does that mean that the United States is absolutely out, isn't going to share, isn't going to finish sending US aid that's been passed by Congress, or share intelligence, or sell weaponry to the Ukrainians? You can't just say we're going to ignore this war that's happening in Europe and move on with other things that we think that will have um, more interest in. You don't get to dictate world events, and that's the real issue, that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have no idea what that means. It's meant to kind of scare up or scare the Ukrainians and Europeans into giving into this, but I've seen quite a few European officials make comments about how unacceptable these terms are.
Yeah,
It really does bring back flashes of the Munich Agreement in 1938, um,
absolutely.
when the UK allowed Nazi Germany to annex a part of Czechoslovakia. and essentially incentivizing aggression and invasion again, and we know how that went. But even if we take away the historical parallels, it's obvious that if you acknowledge someone's right to territory that it invaded, that you're just encouraging them to engage in such behavior again in the future. And I think a lot of European countries understand that if this sort of deal were to be pursued, there are a lot of vulnerable countries in Europe that could be next.
And what happens if Trump would try to lift the sanctions against Russia, or at least the
Well,
US part of them?
Trump has that ability. Trump has the ability, for example, to, stop US aid, but he doesn't have the ability to, block Ukraine from joining the EU, right? The United States is not a member of that. And he doesn't really have the ability to dictate what a peacekeeping force ought to be unilaterally, because the United States is not engaged in that peacekeeping force.
Right.
Um, Ultimately, what I'm seeing over and over again is, and this has been a terrible slow motion at times faster than others, but a slow motion car wreck where you're seeing this over the last couple of months, and you understand that it's always going to go in this direction, which is that Trump fundamentally has some sort of admiration for Vladimir Putin, wants to make not only a deal over Russia, but over sorry, not just a deal over Ukraine, but a broader geopolitical deal that reshapes the nature of world geopolitics. You may or may not have seen his posting on social media today saying "Stop Vladimir," referring to Putin by his first name after Russia engaged in those attacks overnight in Kyiv. Um, that personal touch doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that Trump blinks on this the way he often blinks in other areas when he's told no. There's a lot of bluster, and then he kind of goes away. And we've seen that in the sanctions, rather than the tariffs. We've seen that in threats to fire the Federal Reserve. So we're going to have to see how that works out. I want to lift up a story, Tim, that you did, that is truly remarkable and goes to the heart of corruption, goes to the heart of conflicts of interest, and goes to the heart of this perverse relationship which the United States under Trump has formed with Russia. And it involves Steve Witkoff, who, as you say, is the envoy. He maybe is better known to the public because he was an envoy in the Middle East, but he's also the envoy to Russia. Tell us what you have found.
Well, Steve Witkoff is someone who's been put in charge of diplomatic negotiations between Trump and Putin. And it's worth noting that his experience is in business, not in diplomacy. He has no formal experience in this realm whatsoever. And that shows. That shows when, for example, he forgot the names of the regions that he was negotiating over in an interview recently. But it also creates some serious concerns over his business background and what's involved there. And so me and the team at the Counteroffensive, we investigated Steve Witkoff's business dealings, and what we found was that he had personal stakes at play in the outcome of what's going to happen with Ukraine, Russia. He has business ties to a man named Leonard Blavatnik. He's an influential businessman with significant relationships in Kremlin circles, and he was sanctioned by Ukraine in 2023. So the bottom line is that Steve Witkoff is in business with someone who was identified by Ukraine as someone who is acting against their national interest 2 years ago. And from everything we can tell, these business ties are deep and ongoing. And that should raise serious alarms about whether or not this envoy for the United States can fairly adjudicate, negotiate some sort of deal that is in the interests of all parties, or whether he is, as one transparency watchdog told us, whether Witkoff is already thinking about his next moves in business, even while he's involved in these negotiations. And it is possible that that watchdog group told us that Witkoff is even currently planning investments in Russia or with Russia-friendly money as he is conducting these talks. It's deeply
What
concerning.
is this business associates relationship with the Kremlin and with Russian oligarchs?
Well, this is a man who Len Blavatnik, he's a billionaire. He was born in the former Soviet Union, and he holds U.S. and U.K. citizenship. And what he made his fortune on, though, was in that era right after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So he was involved in that whole process as the Soviet Union began its privatization process, and that led to a lot of folks getting extremely wealthy, now considered what we call the oligarch class in Russia. So Len Blavatnik became a billionaire during this period, or sorry, I don't know if he became a billionaire during this period, but I know that he became very wealthy during this period, and he was, and from what we can tell, he has ties to a lot of the folks who are now billionaires and close in Kremlin circles and have since been sanctioned by the United States as well.
When you get very rich in Russia, does that require, if not a dependency on the Kremlin, at least some kind of political understanding? Or would you, if you don't have such a relationship, face loss of your assets, given the political structure in Russia?
There's been a ton of reporting and factual information out there about the crony capitalism that occurred as the Soviet Union collapsed, and communism gave way to oligarchy. And the fact is that over these years, one could not get very far in, say, the steel industry or other manufacturing industries, the aluminum industry, without having very, very deep ties to what's become the autocratic government of Russia. And that's been well documented.
And have you been able to find whether there are specific ties for this person to the Kremlin or to Putin's inner circle?
Well, we know that he's very close with people like billionaire Victor Vekselberg, and who's been sanctioned by the United States due to his Kremlin ties. The public reporting shows that they've been very close friends. Um, we do not have direct information saying that Mr. Blavatnik is working on behalf of certain political actors in Russia. But what we do know is that he's had these ties. He's been sanctioned by Ukraine, and he's in active and from what we can tell, active and ongoing business dealings with the American envoy to Russia.
And would either Witkoff or the United States government or the Russian government comment for you on this story?
No, we didn't get a response from the White House. We didn't get a response from our attempts to reach out to Witkoff. But obviously, this is something that's seriously concerning, because usually when you enter government, you need to make sure that you don't have any conflicts of interest. And Witkoff is, as far as I understand, operating under a special status that lets him delay some of these typical rules for how your personal finances interacts with your work in public service. And that's something that should really concern us as well. When you bring in people who don't have a ton of experience in diplomacy, but have a ton of experience in business, it makes sense to explore those business ties and see whether they might impact how you conduct diplomacy.
Has Congress to date shown any action in looking into this?
Not yet. Not yet, but we'll be the first over the counteroffensive to report on it if and when they do.
Well, we will be following the story. It's a story every American should be concerned about. It is a perfect example of where the corporate media has failed to do its due diligence. Thank goodness for Tim Mack and his band of independent journalists. And we certainly hope this story and your the reporting gets the attention it deserves. So we will keep following the story. And as you say, if anybody in Congress would like to do something about this, I'm sure you'll be on top of it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.